Yet, also at that time, Japan was in a state of the utmost chaos. There had never been such a history of natural disasters in all of Japan's history. In the 40 years or so, around the time of Nichiren's birth, there were worse and more frequent earthquakes, typhoons, epidemics, floods, droughts, and all other forms of disaster than Japan had ever seen in its whole history, and indeed more than it's ever seen since. So Nichiren Daishonin, as quite a young man, with his natural seeking mind of youth, was saying, if Buddhism is really the truth of life, why is this country that is supposed to be Buddhist suffering so desperately? And he couldn't, because of his seeking mind, reconcile himself to this situation. If Buddhism is the truth, and if Japan is practicing Buddhism, why are the people suffering in tens of thousands, dying of droughts and floods, earthquakes, and goodness knows what? So he, at that time, had a very clear insight into life. He was, if you like, born in an enlightened state. And he basically, deep in his life, understood that Buddhism had gone wrong and where it had gone wrong. And this is clearly seen by his writings of those days. But the point was, of course, he had to prove it to the people, to the ruling authorities, and to the other sects of Buddhism which existed at that time. So for many years, about 15 years, he traveled around all the great Buddhist centers of learning in Japan in order to justify or validate his understanding of the ultimate truth through Buddhist documentation. He wished to link what he knew was right to the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha 2,000 years before him, so that people could see that clearly in the orthodox flow of Buddhism, the practice of chanting MYOHO RENGE KYO was exactly in accordance with Shakyamuni's predictions and the truths which Shakyamuni Buddha had taught all those many years ago. So having done that to his full satisfaction, and having equipped himself, if you like, to debate with anyone who doubted or attacked him for his views, which incidentally he had to do many times in his lifetime, he then returned to his original temple. And on that day, 28th of April, he declared that the fundamental truth of Buddhism was contained in the phrase MYOHO RENGE KYO, and that if people would then devote themselves to it, in other words, Nam, and repeat this phrase over and over to their heart's content, then people, not only of Japan, but of the world, would find that they were overcoming their unhappy destiny, changing their karma, and achieving happy and fruitful, fulfilling lives. But the moment he did that, all hell descended on him. He was a common priest from a poor family. He had no status in society whatsoever. And it caused an uproar. From the very moment he declared this, people from his own temple wished to attack him. Local lord and so on mustered up guards to arrest him. He escaped, and really the rest of his lifetime was involved in battling with persecutions in order to finally establish his teaching firmly so that it would never die when he died himself. This he of course, was able to do. The very fact that we're chanting MYOHO RENGE KYO today, many of us, is proof. So, in many ways, he explained why these persecutions were bound to happen. They, for one thing, fulfilling the predictions of the earlier Buddha Shakyamuni 2,000 years before. 2,000 years before, Shakyamuni clearly stated the various types of persecutions which Nichiren Daishonin, or the Buddha of this age of Mappa, would have to undergo. These predictions were all fulfilled by Nichiren Daishonin. But furthermore, Nichiren Daishonin himself said, as practice strengthens and understanding grows, so devilish forces of life would arise to interfere. Without this, he said, there would be no way of knowing that this was the true law. In other words, if you activate a highly positive force, the negative side of life will first of all resist desperately. This is in the very nature or rhythm of life, in order to prevent that force from winning the battle. It's, in other words, the old story of good and evil, forces of positive and negative that are inherent in life. So even today, when we wish to decide, or we decide we'd like to chant, say, 15 or half an hour's daimoku, or daimoku meaning the invocation of MYOHO RENGE KYO, we'll always find, often find, that the negative force rises up in all sorts of cunning ways, trying to stop us from doing so. Maybe we feel like another cup of coffee, even. Or I must just go and do so-and-so. Or maybe I'll just read the paper first. So even in these small ways, the negative force is evident when you wish to start chanting MYOHO RENGE KYO. This is known in Buddhism as Sancho Shima. That is to say, the 3 obstacles and the 4 devils. 3 obstacles and the 4 devils being representative of the negative force of life, which automatically rises up in the same way as an aeroplane, when it's taking off, meets the resistance of the wind. In fact, it's often compared to that, because an aeroplane needs that resistance in order to fly. Yet that resistance is also trying to hold it up. So in the same way, the resistance of that negative force of life, that battle is in fact what makes us make great effort. So even the resistance is valuable in the end. So it is that effort to overcome the negative force, practices the Buddha taught, which is all involved in that one word, na. Effort. So that little background is enough of the history. But fundamentally, what Nichiren Daishonin realized was that the most important teaching of Buddhism was the teaching which, not surprisingly, Shakyamuni himself had said was his supreme teaching. This was called the Lotus Sutra. And the title of the Lotus Sutra, in fact, in Japanese phonetics, applied to Chinese characters, sounds a bit complicated, is MYOHO RENGE KYO. That the Japanese sound to the classical Chinese characters in which that sutra was written. Of course, it was first written, recorded in Sanskrit. In Sanskrit, it's known as Saddharma Pundarika Sutra. It was then translated into Chinese in the flow of Buddhism. It went from China to Japan, and the sounds of those Chinese characters are MYOHO RENGE KYO. So like all Buddhist teachings, the title contains all of it. The essence of the whole sutra, the meaning of it in all its respect, is contained always in the title. So MYOHO RENGE KYO, that short phrase, 5 characters, MYOHO RENGE KYO, contains the whole truth of Buddhism. Economically, if you like, stored in the depths of meanings of those 5 characters. So Shakyamuni himself had said, this sutra is my supreme teaching. Discard all previous teachings. But this was very difficult for people to understand. And indeed, many of his earlier followers never heard him teach the Lotus Sutra, which was 8 years before he died, in a total of about 50 years of preaching. So that instruction to his disciples of discard all previous teachings was neither understood, often not even heard, and often not therefore followed. However, Nichiren Daishonin appreciated all this in his lifetime, 2,000 years later, and then proceeded to validate it in his writings and his teachings. So, in other words, Nichiren Daishonin was saying, this contains the essence of life. The Lotus Sutra concerns the essential or ultimate truth of life. That truth is contained in the title, MYOHO RENGE KYO. Therefore, if we devote ourselves to that sutra, which is contained, the meaning of it in those 5 characters, we will be in rhythm. He went further to say that this teaching alone contained all the 80,000 teachings of Buddhism. Therefore, those few characters contain the essence of everything. So I hope that's sort of clear for you as a background. So in other words, Shakyamuni in the Lotus Sutra was explaining his theory about life and his experience of enlightenment. But he didn't actually say how one could attain enlightenment through this sutra. The sutra clearly stated that every human being has the Buddha state in him. But the point was, how could it be activated in the same way that Shakyamuni Buddha, or Gautama Buddha as he's known sometimes, activated? But he did say that this sutra would be the supreme teaching for the age of Mappo. That is the age we live in now. And furthermore, he said that in that age, people would have the intellectual capacity to be able to grasp and understand this teaching. And he also, in a sutra, said that a Buddha would be born to a country northeast of where he was preaching in the early stages, the first 500 years of the age of Mappo. And this person's task would be to teach the people of those days how to find happiness through the Lotus Sutra. So this was the background to Nichiren Daishonin declaring MYOHO RENGE KYO. So in the writing that I referred to before on attaining Buddhahood, Nichiren Daishonin said this: therefore, when you chant the mystic law, MYOHO RENGE KYO, and recite the Lotus Sutra, that is reciting certain verses of the Lotus Sutra, which we also do every day as part of our practice, to the subject of another lecture, you must summon up deep conviction that MYOHO RENGE KYO is your life itself. So although MYOHO RENGE KYO is life in the whole universe, the force of life itself, it is also your life itself. And in many other writings and teachings, Nichiren Daishonin said, unless you understand that MYOHO RENGE KYO is your life, you're not practicing my Buddhism. In other words, this practice does not concern an external power to which supplication has to be made in order to find happiness. What Buddhism is teaching is that the power is within you. Of course, it's outside you too, but to no more or greater extent that it's also in you. Therefore, the whole purpose is to find the key to unlock the door and release this force in one's own life. This force that passing through the Buddha stage has the ingredients of all the qualities of the Buddha. Qualities of wisdom, compassion, courage, and so on. So now I'd like to just go on and explain the other words in this phrase in a little more detail. First of all, MYOHO. MYOHO has the literal meaning mystic law. Myo is mystic. Ho means law. Another way, though, of understanding this would be to say mystic is something unseen, difficult to understand. Kyo, or law, is something seen. So, of course, we all know that life consists of both a spiritual aspect and a physical, material aspect. So, Ho, you could say, is the material or seen aspect of life. And Myo is the spiritual or unseen aspect. Myo and Ho also can mean Ho, life, Myo, death, or Ho, manifest, Myo, latent. All these meanings contained in the character Myo and Ho. So this is fundamental to Buddhism's understanding of the truth of life. In other words, all aspects of life, both in a spiritual and a material sense, are constantly passing through phases of life and death, seen and unseen. That every one of all the myriad phenomena of life, all the manifestations of life force that we see around us, is passing through this amazing cycle, seen and unseen. So, of course, we see it in life and death, in a human being or an animal, but furthermore, we see it even in the spiritual qualities or the spiritual emotions. Sadness can rise up and appear and become manifest in the form of tears or a gloomy face. Something changes in that person's life, and that disappears, and a smile takes its place. Where does the sadness go? Certainly it's not disappeared from one's life, because you've only got to have another circumstance arise for that sadness to appear again. The same with joy and all the other emotions. They become manifest, but where do they go when they're not manifest? Of course, there can only be only one answer: they're latent. Always there in one's life, existing yet non-existing, as the Buddha described. So this is what everything in life is doing. Everything in this whole universe is passing through seen state into an unseen state, and back into a seen state, so on. This is part of the rhythm of life. The rhythm of life, Buddhism says, is that everything in it is passing through a cycle, which is seen at one point and unseen at the other point. Or as it's sometimes described, the cycle of birth, maturity, death, and then latency, which is described in Buddhism by a very simple word, AU, and then birth again. So, of course, if this is happening in the case of joy or sadness, if it's happening in the case of trees and plants, animals, why should human beings be any different? It would be nothing else but arrogance to imagine that we should be different to everything else in the universe. Of course, this is also happening in us. And once we become aware of this rhythm of myo and ho, we can actually see it working in our own lives. We can realize it in an actuality in our daily life. So this is MYOHO, this constant cycle of every living thing in its state of manifestation and latency. So the period of latency has a purpose. But that purpose is linked to the law of MYOHO RENGE KYO. The purpose of the period of latency is to activate sufficient life force in and around that entity of life so that it is strong enough to support another physical surrounding, to appear, in other words, once again, which it must do in the very rhythm of life, in physical form, and contribute to the functioning of this world and of the great universe. This is the period of latency, which we call death in human terms. Yet it's far from death. It's no different from sleep in a way, in that we must sleep in order to gain energy for the next day. There one is referring to mechanical energy. In the case of state of death, it's a period when we must regenerate our life force in order to take on another physical form. So that is the aspect of life which Buddhism, which Nichiren described as MYOHO, the law of life. But this law has another most important facet, and that is described in the word renge. Renge literally means a lotus flower. And the lotus flower is quite a unique thing in the world of nature because it produces its flower and seed at the same time.